Good morning. You know something? We're never done. You or me is never done. We're always complete. Complete in our wholeness. It's just a recognition. It's the process of remembering what we've always known. But meanwhile, as long as we're breathing in and out, our lives are works in progress on all levels, particularly the spiritual level. Having completed 2 days ago sharing about echoes from the future, I have to look at the other side today. Echoes from the past. And this has been particularly meaningful for me, as my younger brother has just completed his move to Taiwan from Hawaii, joining me here in Wagagan. We're now the only missing piece of the puzzle, 2 pieces, is his dog and his wife, and they'll be, within the week, they'll be here too. And thus begins a new chapter. But I mentioned occasions, the past coming to the present. So we haven't lived near each other, this close to each other, in 40 to 50 years. It's been a long time. Each of us had our own paths to pursue. And even while we were both in Hawaii at the same time, there was some overlap. He had traveled to live in California for a while and came back. There was an overlap before I was moving on to Taiwan. But we both had our work cut out for us, our own paths to pursue. We'd see each other, but not that often. And now, as we both have more time, I think that pattern will be broken. I look forward to spending a lot of time with him. Now, so that's part of the echoes from the past, opening into the future, and most importantly, the present. But there is another side, as there always is. Because even though balance doesn't come that easy to me, the universe has a way of doing it for you. And this was about my state of equanimity. It's a fairly new state for me to dwell in. It's only been a matter of a couple years to be in this state. But what I want to talk today about is 2 incidents in the last 6 months that lent or caused me to fall out of this state, reminding me that it requires vigilance and constant alertness to remain. But why I want to mention these 2 events is that I want to share with you, in the hopes that it might be helpful, of my process of dealing with setbacks. Searching out the roots looking for my lesson, looking for areas that still need attention and work. And the first one had to do with a former student who came to visit me in Hualien. And we were standing in line at the breakfast place, placing our order. And this thoughtless, seemingly rude man stepped right in front of us, pushed his way right in front of us so that he could put his breakfast order in. And then he said something in Chinese that I didn't understand, but my student translated for me. He said, "Get out of my way," to her in a very rude. The tone was all I needed to understand. And I immediately got into his face, not from anger, but I let him know. I forced him to back up. We never made physical contact, but I made him back up and cool his jets. And then I quietly, or maybe not so quietly, semi-calmly, told him that his behavior was not tolerable. And everybody around me, the lady behind the counter, that's my friend, my student, everybody, any witnesses, everybody went silent. Because when I'm called upon, I'm a pretty formidable antagonist, pretty formidable foe, because I won't back down. When I feel I'm in the right, as this situation, I will not back down. And that intensity is communicated. And I've yet to have an occasion when I was in this condition that the other party didn't back down. And I'm not saying that with pride or hubris. I'm just stating a fact. But even though I never really raised my voice, the effort involved, feeling bad about my lapse from equanimity, wondering if there wasn't a better way to handle this. It took a couple days, and it really upset my equilibrium. And interestingly enough, later on in the day, in the errands that we were running, we encountered the same individual in another completely different setting. And he was not willing or able to make eye contact. Perhaps I would have apologized, but I really don't think so. No apology was due. My apology was to myself. My forgiveness became for myself because I lost my state, or I surrendered, I think is a better word. I voluntarily gave up my state of equilibrium. And it took a couple days to get it back. Not through any rationalization, firmly facing and looking at it as an error on my part and a willingness to forgive without forgetting. So this sat with me all these months, about 6 months ago, I guess, last March, maybe more than 6 months. And recently, after shopping with my younger brother, we decided to have some shabu shabu, some stir fry that's right there, a restaurant right there as you leave the grocery store. So I went and got a table as he was going through the checkout counter and paying for his groceries. And I went inside this restaurant with big open door. It's actually part of the grocery store. It's just wide open with seats and benches and then his grill to cook your food. Went in and started looking in the menu and seeing what I would select. And as he walked up, my brother walked up with his cart of groceries. He just kind of shrugged to me, like, what do I do with this? And I motioned for him to bring it in to the restaurant with us. And all of a sudden, this fairly good-sized younger fellow bellowed. He yelled almost at the top of his voice to something in Chinese, obviously saying, we can't do that. But I didn't like his tone or his intent. He was yelling at my younger brother. So any idea of food just didn't sit well. And I motioned to him that we just leave. But I couldn't leave it at that. I went back and stood in front of the fellow. And he's looking, in his eyes, he's looking at a foreigner. He said, doesn't understand what I'm saying. But I used body language to communicate to him fairly firmly in my way, with direct eye contact, getting up close and personal, and told him that he didn't need to yell. A simple hand motion, no, simple, but this screaming was not acceptable. And as I stood looking in his eyes, as long as he would look, probably glaring on my part, but still in controls of my faculties. I just would not let this stand. And he looked in my eyes and he started to say something, and then he swallowed it. So when I was convinced that he had gotten my message, language barrier or no, I left the restaurant with my brother. And again, when I was in the throes of this, in the experience, everybody around me was uncomfortable. My brother was uncomfortable. But I had laser beam focus on one individual. But I wasn't immune to the consequences of this action. No one felt comfortable. And we left, and my remorse was pretty quick in coming, but I decided that no sense in voicing it. My brother knows me. He understands that sometimes we act, it seems rashly, and then suffer remorse. Again, my remorse was not based on so much my action as equanimity. The state of equanimity disappeared. I realized that not to take it for granted is a very fragile condition. So I wanted to share this, wrinkles and all. But what took place afterwards is, for me, is much more import than the event and my feeling of remorse. Before, it usually takes a couple of days to calm back down, forgive myself, and move on. I'm kind of stuck in limbo, dealing with this over and over, replaying the scene in my mind, because this is how my mind works. Even with my sharings, it's all been played out in my mind first. It's as if I wrote down a text, but the text is here, because even for me, there's some disconnect between here and writing, or more likely, computing, recording it electronically. There's some disconnect, but it's... So this whole thing takes place here. And later, when it was time to rest, I used to go to bed an hour or so before I actually fall asleep, read my ebooks on my iPad, and relax, and have a little bit of closure, a review of the day. Well, obviously I had a lot to review that day, and it made it tougher to relax into sleepy mode. My mind was wound up. And then all of a sudden, I just felt this engulfing. My whole body was swept away with the realization. And this is where echoes from the past really come in. Echoes from the past are seemingly more real than echoes from the future. At least echoes from the past, you can speculate, you can believe, you can think that the events occurred. But one thing you can be sure of is that the disconnect between memory and actual events can be small to really large. We choose what we want to remember, just as we choose what we want to forget. I believe that subconscious or conscious level, we do this process of deciding what to hold on to, deciding what to let go of. So this overwhelming insight, this overwhelming understanding just swept through my body, bringing ease, peace, completion to my troubled temporary condition. And this was that I was acting as a protective big brother. I was the oldest of 3 of us. My brother 2 years behind me, my sis 2 years behind him. Our father passed away when I was not yet 4. When my mother was pregnant with my sister, my brother was not yet 2. And like it or not, real or not real, I assumed responsibility at that tender age as the big brother. It was my job to keep an eye on my brother and sister. It was my responsibility. And that moment, 2 nights ago, it hit me just like a 2x4 upside the head. A thunderbolt hit me, realizing that I was still carrying that responsibility. And in many ways, an unfair responsibility. But it was not imposed. It was self-accepted. I just saw this as my role, my responsibility. I became kind of like a little dad. And this included my mother, because she was very emotionally challenged and troubled. And sensing this, I took a lot of responsibility upon myself for her well-being, with the limited capacity, the limited abilities, the limited understandings of a less than 4-year-old. And I've talked before about putting my bag full of shit down and how relieved I felt. But there's always more. I found this sense of responsibility that I'd been carrying for all these years without even full awareness, and keeping it separate somehow. Quarantined from my other more apparent weight on my shoulders. Here's a new one. Well, not new, but it took me a long time to discover, just days ago. And the disconnect from my sense of responsibility. My brother's 68 years old. We're not 4 and 2. We haven't been for a long, long time. But I was still carrying this burden of responsibility. And with the previous incident with my student, I feel very fatherly and protective of all my students. And I had extended this sense of responsibility to include them. This need to protect. So I can't say at this point if I've completely put this down. Time will tell. But the process, what I noticed as this before this epiphany happened, was that I looked for commonalities, like I do. Look for commonalities. The commonalities was I was with someone else, someone who I felt big brotherly to, if not fatherly. But these events never occurred when I was by myself. It only occurred, these two incidences only occurred I'm with somebody else. So that's the commonality. Someone else that I feel responsible to. Second commonality. Third, none of this was directed to me. Either encounter was not directed to me. It was directed towards someone I felt responsible for. To protect, to shelter. And these are unrealistic expectations because we can protect, truthfully, we can protect no one, least of all ourselves. So to extend it to protecting somebody else is really not rational. And I was dealing with an irrational response. As a 4-year-old, I was no more equipped to be responsible for anything, much less my brother, my sister, and my mother. I wasn't even able to be responsible for myself. Responsible means lack of dependency. As a 4-year-old, you certainly are dependent. But real or not real mattered not. I carried this burden of being responsible for, again, people I felt either big brotherly or fatherly towards. The emotion, the consequence was the same, whether it's father or brother. It's the chronological elder brother that wins out. So we talk about firstborn, secondborn in my family, thirdborn, and a lot of number 2 and number 3, my brother and sister, as adults, have gotten together with me and said, you were always mom's favorite. Well, how do you answer that? And the reality is that there was lots of pictures of me as a young boy, infant and young boy. And when my brother came along, there was always the 2 of us. He was seldom in a picture by himself. And my sister never even we can't find really any pictures of her as a baby or a youth. But the other side of the coin was this responsibility that I've been carrying all these years. Mostly safely quarantined so that I didn't consciously consider it, envelop it, be it. But maybe that was a side bag. I had a big, heavy bag, but maybe I had a strap and a side bag. We're quarantined. We all quarantine events. This is our self-protective mode. Do not have to deal with things. And what I'm saying in this continuum, this ongoing, never-ending process, actually there's never a beginning and there's never an end. You make a decision at a certain point to consciously pursue maybe your spiritual journey, to nowhere. Maybe you make a conscious decision. Maybe it starts subconsciously or unconsciously. Unconscious lies below subconscious, and then conscious envelops. So it's kind of like concentric circles. Unconscious, subconscious, conscious, but the conscious just opens up. But it does contain these, within itself, contain these two things, and actually helps to subconscious, unconscious, subconscious is part of our consciousness. And sooner or later, as we get the tools of recognition, of cognition, of cogitating, meditating, reflecting, just as I got this gift of recognition that my state of equanimity is fragile, have to have vigilance coupled with forgiveness and recognition that you can leave this state. I've said before that once you've awakened to the realness of the universe, there's no going back. But consequences, this equanimity, which was a result of my journey from progressive awakening to permanent awakening, was part of that. But you have to be vigilant. You cannot just take anything for granted. Something, especially something as beautiful as being in a state of equanimity. So if you do lose, if you do temporarily forget, whether it's because of echoes from the past, as my case, or echoes from the future. I think the fear is in the future. The past is past. Nothing to fear. But if fear can creep in, there's another way for losing temporarily or permanently your states of mind that grace and compassion and love have provided you with. So, having recognized that, working on putting this quarantine bag of shit aside, I share with you that